looks like we have a quorum and our first meeting for the new budget year. So we'll go ahead and start with welcome and introductions. And I don't know your name, so and I can't see your tag.
Oh, it's David Alfonso,
Okay,
the principal of Palm Beach Lakes High School.
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Steve Sills, representing Chuck Shaw.
Sherry Brown representing Erica Whitfield.
Heather Canoose, Budget Director.
Leanne Adams, Treasurer.
Faith Schulstrom, representing Frank Barbieri.
Carmen Campbell, representing Marsha Andrews, District 6,
Good
and
morning.
the school district.
Kevin McCormick, Exceptional Student Education.
And any public comments? It doesn't look like we have anyone here today. Once in a while we have somebody, but not today. Can we approve the minutes from June 4th?
So move.
Second.
All those in favor, those opposed, motion carries unanimously. And we're going to do a 21 budget development update.
Yep, I can't believe we're already talking about fiscal year 21. So welcome to the start of the new year. And I did send out an email. We had our first board budget workshop in December, and I sent that link out to the committee members. So if you did watch that meeting, the first part of the presentation is going to seem very similar because it is the same presentation that was presented to the board. So you do know, just as a recap, that the majority of our funding is really determined by the state legislature, and that's based on the calculation of the Florida Education Finance Program, or FEFP. The State Board of Education gives release their proposed budget for FY20 on August 21st, and they were looking at an increase in the BSA of $50 per student. The Office of Economic Demographic Research released their long-range financial outlook on September 12th, and it's due no later than September 15th. They're looking at an increase of about 2%. The governor released his proposed budget November 18th, and we're waiting on right now the House and the Senate to release their budget proposals. It looks like they're going to be out the end of January, so we're really going to focus on the governor's proposal. The legislative session starts early every other year, so on even years, it starts in January and finishes up in March, which is nice to have it done earlier in the year because that means we can finish the budget a little earlier. So the local school board does have some authority, but that's also capped by the legislature. We do know that the additional operating millage that was approved by the voters is in place for 4 years. So FY20 was the first year of that increased referendum. So we're going to have it for another 3 years. But there was some, in the legislature last year, they approved that any new referendums that go to the voters must be shared with charter schools. So this referendum that we have now is not being shared with charter schools, but if there isn't a legislative change, when we go in another 4 years, we would have to share whatever referendum proceeds we receive with the charter schools. And they're about 11% of our population. We also have the penny sales tax that was approved by the voters and goes through 2026. So how is the Florida Education Finance Program funded? We get a lot of questions. I don't know if you've received I know you've all received your property tax bills, and there's a number on your property tax bill. We're the first number. My department is the first number on that tax bill, so we get a lot of questions from the community asking, you know, why are their taxes so high for schools? Why do they have to pay for schools? And in the state of Florida, that's how we fund it. So education is funded through local sources, which is your property taxes, and state sources, which is primarily your sales tax. So the chart on the left-hand side is the statewide average. So if you look at just across the state, property taxes funds about 43% of FEFP, and the state sources or their sales taxes is about 57%. And when you look in Palm Beach County, it's the inverse. So you hear a lot of the times we're a donor county, we're a property-rich county. That's because our property taxes pay 61% of what we're receiving for education. So since we have such a large property tax base, we then get less in state funding. If you add in the referendum that was recently passed, that actually increases the amount being funded by local sources up to 66%. For the statewide average, I had to exclude that just because I didn't have the dollar amounts for all the different counties that have passed referendums recently. And so looking at the state budget, we have the state budget for FY20 was $90.9 billion. And we wanted to look at how much is FEFP of the total state budget. So looking at FY20, FEFP was $12.5 billion, which represents 13.77%. And we wanted to look back and see, is that consistent with how much the state had funded education in the past? So we went back to 2000, and FEFP actually comprised 14.21% of the total budget. You know, 0.5% doesn't seem like a lot, but that actually equates to $400 million less in FEFP that we would be receiving when you're looking at the budget, the state budget in total. And that's because the state has had a lot of competing priorities when it comes to primarily health and human services. So you know that there's a lot of variation between the proposals that come out from the State Board of Education to the governor, to the House and the Senate, to what we actually end up receiving. So this gives a historical look back from FY17. You can see the final conference rate has, was 1% in, that's what we actually received, was 1% increase per student in 17, was 1.39% in 18 and 19. And FY20, if you back out the best and brightest, because that really was more of a shell game, because it was being funded by the state, but it was being funded outside of the FEFP, and then in FY20 they shifted it to FEFP and then called it an increase, even though they were funding it previously. So if you were to exclude that, the increase is really 1.92%. And if you're looking at the breakout down below that, you can also see the difference between BSA, that's our base student allocation. When we get money in base student allocation, that's where we have the most flexibility. Categoricals are state mandates, so whatever we get that money for, we have to spend it for that purpose. So you can see over the last several years, there's been a trend that there's been more money going into state mandates or those state categoricals and less into the base student allocation. So now looking at FY21, the State Board of Education is recommending a 1.12% increase in per student funding. And when we presented this to the board, one of the board members asked and said, the State Board of Education, aren't they the ones who are supposed to be supporting education? So why is their request so low? And the reason is because the new Commissioner of Education is Richard Corcoran, who was Speaker of the House. And if you go back the past couple years, looking at the final conference and where we ended up and the House proposals of 0.2% and 1.3%, it makes sense that now that he's the Commissioner of Education, that his proposal of 1.12% is consistent with his track record of recommended increases in education funding. The Office of Economic and Demographic Research has an increase of 2%, and that's based on just averaging the last 3 years of per student increases. The governor's proposal is 3.94% increase, and we'll get into more detail, but the main reason for that increase is the new teacher proposal that he has in place and raising the minimum teacher pay up to $47,500.
So does that proposal does not exist in the other two?
It does not.
budgets?
That does not right now. And it does seem like the House, that's why we're interested to see with the House and the Senate, what are they going to come out with? Because we are in support of putting more money into teacher salary, but that proposal really has some unintended consequences, because if you're just raising up the minimum salary, you're going to have teachers that have several years of experience that are going to be making the same amount of money as somebody just starting out of school that's brand new. So if you don't do something for all teachers, then it's just going to exacerbate the salary compression issues that we already have. And we were trying to fix with the referendum that was just passed. So we are hopeful that the proposals that come from the House and the Senate will somehow address that situation, because I know that it has been brought forward by CTA and other organizations that just raising up the minimum is just going to create more problems, although we are supportive of putting money into teacher pay.
Does that also include his change to best and brightest?
It does. And so we'll go through that in more detail. And then we have two members that just joined us. So if you would, I don't know if you want to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Karen Marcus. I'm here for Barbara McQuinn.
Kathy Gunlack here for Karen Brill.
Okay. So now with the next two charts, what we're trying to do is determine, we need to estimate where we're going to be for per student funding. So what could we look at to determine that? That blue line is the percentage growth in state general revenue. And in the past, our percentage increase in per student funding prior to the Great Recession used to align really closely with the increase in state general revenue. So if state general revenue was going to increase by 4%, then we would see an increase in per student funding of 4%. We have not seen that in the past several years. There is that one blip in FY20, and the reason for that is the loss of revenue from Indian gaming. But it does go back up slightly when you look at FY21. The red bar is inflation, and the green is the percentage increase in per student funding. So we can at least say that in FY20, at least our increase in per student funding aligned with inflation, because in prior years we were even below inflation. So looking at percentage of general revenue really isn't reflective of what we're going to get in an increase in per student funding. This one shows you the increase in property values. So that top bar is the percentage growth in school taxable value. So that's the true growth in school taxable value. The yellow bar is the percentage growth in legislative approved RLE. So that's where the legislature is rolling back the RLE so that we only collect the same amount that we did last year, allowing only for the growth in new construction. So accounting for that component of the new construction, the increase is about 2%. And so that's why I'm projecting that I think we're going to be at a 2% increase in per student funding, because that looks like how it's aligned the past 2 years, that whatever that growth in new construction is, that's the amount of increase that we've been seeing in the per student funding.
And what are you projecting? It looks like you're dropping in property values between 20 and 21. Are you looking at values dropping?
That is based on, well, it's the percentage increase.
Oh, okay, percentage
It's the percentage increase, and this is based on EDR.
Okay.
And EDR provides an assessment and projection of the ad valorem assessment. And so it's just that they're projecting it to not grow as much.
Right.
And so you can see the governor is, at 3.94%. The legislative budget request is at 1.12%. And I'm looking at the 2%, which is similar with the EDR, but that's based on two different calculations. But it looks like 2% is a possibility. So looking at the statewide outlook, EDR is already warning, saying that growth is slowing, so we need to be careful about that. Looking at the state forecast, they do have some shortfalls in 22 and 23. The biggest concern that I see is the Florida retirement system. Something the legislature is going to be considering this session is there's a recommendation that they need to reduce the assumed rate of return from 7.4% to 7.2%. So 0.2% does not seem like a lot, but that increases the amount of contribution that we would have to make significantly. So the increase, if the legislature were to agree to this reduction in the rate of return, we would need to contribute $233 million more, just the school districts. Our portion of that would be $17 million.
And also with the increase proposal for teacher salaries would cause an increase in your FRS
It would.
commitment also, too.
Yep, yep, it would. And then we already talked about, so we don't know what the legislature is going to approve. I don't believe that they would go down to the 7.2, but I think that they would start chipping away at it. So it's going to be something in between no increase and 17.2 million, so, probably around 2.5 to 5
What does that mean
million.
exactly, the assumed rate of return and how that impacts the,
It's the assumed rate of return on the investments and because the contributions are being invested so
Right.
that we can have the amount of funds available in order to pay for the retirement when it's being requested. So when you reduce your assumed rate of return, you're going to be earning less, so that increases your liability. You're going to need more.
so
does
in order to
that-
have the same amount available, they will ask districts to make up the difference? Is that what
Right,
I'm-
correct.
And-
Because, well, not just districts, it would be all participating entities, and so the 233 million is just school districts.
I see.
And is there any review of their investment team?
Yes, they have, they have an,
I mean, other states' retirement funds are increasing, not decreasing at their rate of return, right?
our FRS program is actually well-funded. It's one of the,
But what they're saying,
right, they're saying that
is they're not going to do as well, and it seems that they should look internally before they begin to charge school districts.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction because of the recession, and you didn't earn money. You can look at your personal savings account and earned basically nothing. This is yours, Leanne, probably more than me, but still, you have to look at a long-term average. So, I mean, the actuaries think it's a little too high, so that's why they're having to kind of chip away a little bit. And they've done a couple of drops over the last couple of years in this. So hopefully it won't be quite that much. It's just that, I think 2019 was a good year for investing. So they probably had bigger returns than 7%. So
Right,
it's a
and
tough call.
I'd also mention that Florida's FRS system seems to be more on top of updating the returns. And a lot of others that I've seen are reacting 2 and 3 years later. So they're increasing rates now when Florida increased them a couple years ago. And now they're already dropping them because they're seeing the long-term returns drop. And that's really, if you look at interest rates, while the stock market's doing really well, everything else, interest rates are very low. So they've got a wide variety of assets in that pool. They have stocks, but they also have real estate and they have bonds. So they have all kinds of securities in there, and overall interest rates are down. And all indications of the stock market's not going to be able to continue the returns they've had when every other market is dropping off. So I think they're trying to prepare for that, to make sure that they keep the retirement system well-funded. Florida is one of the best funded in the country, so they want to keep that reputation in place. But it doesn't mean
My
that we would
question was
end
a
up
little
paying more.
sarcastic.
but there is a detailed analysis that is provided, that's out there, that the legislature will consider. And then so we talked about the State Board of Education increase of $50 increase in BSA. $50 increase in the BSA equates to about $8.5 million for us for district-operated schools. So we know that's less than a 1% raise. When you look at the governor's proposal, we talked about this, so it's a total of $13.2 billion. And if we were to apply that to his proposed FY21 state budget, that would make FEFP 14.49% of the total state budget, which would get us above what it was back in 2000. So at least we'd be going in the right direction. So he's proposing $600 million to increase that minimum teacher pay to $47,500, and $300 million for the revamped Best and Brightest program, which is this Florida Classroom Teacher Principal Bonus Program. And in the governor's proposal, he talks a lot about FRS and says that, it is a very well-funded program. So I don't believe he's including anything in his budget for an increase in FRS. It was hard to tell. There was nothing that was spelled out. He was more just touting, that it is a very well-funded plan. So now this is a detailed look at the governor's proposal. We've seen this before, but this is the impact for Palm Beach County. So if we start there on row 1, that's the unweighted full-time equivalent students, so the number of students that the state is projecting that we're going to have next year is going to be an increase of 1,300 or 1,318. I do expect that that's going to change because we're waiting for the final third calculation to come out, which for FY20, which is going to reflect the actual enrollment as of October 2019. We are seeing an increase in our district. We even received a call from the state making sure that that increase was accurate. So that leads me to believe that they're seeing this across the state, and that's why they haven't released the third calculation. They want to make sure the numbers are right before they release it. So it's going to be interesting to see whether they're going to increase the number of students, that they're expecting more growth statewide than they had in the past. And so we're now trying to look in, and they're asking us as well, you know, why? Why are we seeing this increase? So we're trying to dig into that as well to determine that.
Is it in overall, is it in district population, or is it in charter schools, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. Charter schools went up about 1,000 students. District schools went up about 700 students. And so if you remember, we were thinking we were going to have an increase of about 800, and we thought we'd split it with charter schools. So we were close with splitting with charter schools, but we were at 1,700 instead of 800 students. The Family Empowerment Scholarship is also included within our unweighted FTE numbers. That we ended up having 681 students that were not all. Not all the students actually attended district schools, because in order to be eligible for that Florida Empowerment Scholarship, you had to be going into kindergarten, so they might not have ever been in our schools. And then if you had siblings, the siblings were also eligible. So of the 681 from Palm Beach County, I believe about 250 were actually from left Palm Beach County operated schools and charter schools.
And went to private schools.
And went to private schools. The rest of them were either new kindergarten students or they were already in private schools already. So if you see the base student allocation, the governor is also proposing an increase of $50 per student. That next row there is the district cost differential. And right now you're seeing that is no change. And the district cost differential is that calculation that's really, allowing us to adjust for cost of living. And if you remember last year, the legislature approved the Office of Economic Demographic Research to prepare a new methodology for calculating the DCD. That was supposed to be released October 1st. They were supposed to get district input. It's now, January 9th, and we have not seen a proposal. I know that Mr. Burke is going to be going up to the legislature next week, and I think that's one of the items they're going to be talking about is the DCD. So we'll see whether there is a proposal that's going to be released. So we're not sure whether the DCD calculation is going to change. Whether there's something that's going to be pushed through the legislative session that we haven't even seen yet, or whether they're going to just stick with the current methodology and maybe push it off another year.
Have they asked for your input at this point?
We have not received a request for input.
It hasn't even started, as far as you know.
Right, and I know when we started looking at it last year, part of it is they want the new calculation to be based on wages. And looking at some of the counties, looking at wages is just not a fair representation. Like looking at Monroe, for example, it's very expensive to live in Monroe, but the wages are very low. And so they would have to make adjustments anyway. So it's not just an easy calculation. And so I don't know that they've had the staff and the time to really put forth the effort to come up with a proposal for us to even look at. So we'll hopefully learn more next week. And by your next meeting, we should have more information as to whether we're going to be sticking with the Florida Price Level Index or whether we'll be looking at possibly a new calculation. But looking at the district cost differential, we are one of the highest districts. We receive over $30 million in addition to the regular funding as a result of this district cost differential. So we're watching it very closely because it could have a significant impact to our budget. So the next section, rows 6 through 19, are all the state categoricals. There really aren't many changes. The governor is proposing an increase in the mental health allocation, so that's about 1.7 million. And then moving down to the state categorical programs, you can see the Florida classroom teachers compensation. That total is $35.9 million or $36 million. That's the amount of money that we would receive in order to increase the minimum teacher salary up to $47,500. And that would also have to be shared with charter schools. And then the best and brightest allocation, I moved that down just for comparison purposes. So you could see last year we received almost $20 million. You can see under the new bonus allocation plan, we'd receive about $18.5 million. So pretty close to the amount that we're receiving this year for best and brightest. So the total state funding increase would be $44.7 million based on the governor's proposal.
Are we going to talk in more detail about that teacher compensation as we move through this? Because I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, there will be some more detailed slides that actually show what the calculation, you know, how much it will cost us to apply that to all teachers and all of that. Yeah. So now looking at the increase in the tax roll in Palm Beach County, it's projected to increase by 5%. And then looking at the enrollment increase of the 1,300, we are expecting to split that enrollment increase with charter schools again. So that brings us down to net district funding of $53.3 million. If we look at just the governor's proposal all in with all the teacher compensation proposals, it would be an increase of $280 per FTE, 3.47%. If you back out the teacher compensation and best and brightest programs, that brings it down to 1.27%. And then if you back out the mental health allocation, because we already have that set aside as to what it will be spent on with the co-located services, that's an increase of the 1.17%. So it brings us back in line with what we've been seeing in the past of the 1% increases. And so $53 million, it always seems like a lot of money, but it really does go fast. So we talked about the FRS, that it's going to be anywhere between 0 and 17 million. You know, my guess is about $2.5 to $5 million increase, potential increase in FRS next year. We need to back out the increase in the mental health allocation because that needs to be spent on our mental health plan. So our portion of that is $1.5 million. Looking at the teacher compensation program, our portion, net of the amount that would be passed through to charter schools, is $31.9 million. With an increase in revenue, we'd have to increase our contingency reserve. Even though we haven't settled this year with our bargaining units, we will settle at some point. So we do have to set aside for those bargaining units that are effective January 1st. We do have to set aside a full year of raises for the next year. Since we are expecting an increase in enrollment, we are going to have some increased staff, so we have to set aside an increase to cover that increased staff. And then our goal is to always set aside a salary bargaining reserve equal to whatever we receive from the state. So we'd back out that portion for the teacher compensation program, so that's a total of $12.7 million. So with the governor's proposal, we would be setting aside over $40 million for salary, you know, that we would have available for salary adjustments for teachers and staff. And that pretty much the budget is fully spent at that point. The referendum, with the increase in property taxes, we will see an increase in the referendum of about almost $10 million, but that's already fully spent because we still have vacant school police officers that we're going to continue to fill this upcoming year. We have additional co-located service providers that we want to fund, and we do expect to have an increase in teacher supplements. Right now with the teacher supplements, over 12,000 teachers are receiving supplements. And the teachers are very appreciative of the increase in their checks. They started receiving them at the start of the school year in August, and we are very thankful to the community for the support with the referendum. We do know we have issues, although we are in support of adding money, the governor's proposal to add money for teacher pay. It does create some unintended consequences, which I talked about. And then we have been seeing declining enrollment the past couple years in our neighboring districts. So what is FY21 going to look like? You know, is FY20 going to be a blip, or are we going to start seeing declining enrollment in Palm Beach County? So our current starting salary in Palm Beach County, so we're going to start with looking at the starting teacher pay, the governor's proposal. Our starting teacher salary is $41,000. About 50% of our teachers make less than the proposed minimum by the governor of $47,500. So if we were to just raise the minimum, everybody up to the minimum of $47,500, that would cost us about $28 million. That increase between $47,500 and $41,000 represents an almost 16% increase in pay. If we were to give all of our teachers an increase of 15.85%, it would cost us $122 million. So much more than the $30 million that we're going to receive. And also there's restrictions on, you know, would we even be able to use any of that additional money between the $27 million and the $30 million? Would we be able to even use it for additional salary groups? And there is there was a bill that was filed to give some flexibility that once you get up to the minimum, any remaining amount could be used for other salary proposals. If we were to just give all teachers a raise of $6,500, that would cost $96.1 million. So you had some questions?
Yeah, the whole notion of base salary of $47,500. Obviously, that's different in our district, given our current base salary compared to other districts around the state.
Correct.
So do all districts get enough money to raise
Yes.
salary? So
Yes,
the per teacher amount may vary from district to district.
Based on the governor's proposal, the minimum in Florida would be $47,500 regardless of where you lived.
Correct, which means that if your current starting salary is $38,000, they have to get more per teacher to make that leap than we do. Is that?
Yes.
Is that the way the funding is distributed? The other thing is, in Palm Beach County, you've got charter schools that share this money, but they're not all at the same base salary as district. Do they get enough money to raise their teachers to $47,500, or do they get the same $6,500 per teacher?
Well, when we did the calculation, we're getting our portion of the allocation would be about $31 million. The actual cost to us is $27.7 million. So they must have looked at the statewide average and then looked at the difference in order to come up with the $600 million to say that's the actual cost we're going to allocate. I haven't done the analysis to look at every district statewide to see whether their allocation is sufficient to bring them up to that $47,500. But I think looking at ours, I would think it should be at least close.
And in-district charter schools are also expected to meet that same base salary?
My understanding is, based on the way the bill is written, charter schools are not excluded, but they weren't specifically mentioned. So I would believe that they would have to increase it, but you never know with charter schools. They can make up the rules, so I'm not sure.
Beginning salaries here vary widely.
Right, because there are some that follow the district schedule and some that pay way less. And we have had some issues with some charter schools recently. Just the number of substitutes that they're using compared to certified teachers has created some issues when looking at our Title I comparability. We have Title I schools that don't appear to have sufficient number of certified teachers when compared to non-title schools, because we need to include charter schools when we're looking at that calculation with all district schools. So we can't separate them out, and that was a change a couple years ago.
Question 2, the group that's included under the umbrella of the governor's proposal does not include all people in the bargaining unit in Palm Beach County, am I correct? Do you know?
I do not have an answer to your question, but that's something I can look into and
Yeah.
come back with.
My understanding is that there's like media specialists, possibly guidance counselors, that are left out of the
Yeah, because they had to be actual
classroom teachers with a schedule, is my understanding, but maybe speech pathology. I mean, there's a huge group that would be left out, which is, and the fact that it takes so many other people besides teachers to educate a child, that they're all left out too. It's so short-sighted.
Well, and the issue too, that you're going to have somebody with, 5 years of experience making the same amount as somebody who's a brand-new teacher. They need to do it. I can't say enough that we are supportive of putting $600 million into teacher pay, but you need to do something for all teachers, maybe in a phased-in approach. And to your point, I was presenting recently to an outside organization, and their concern was, okay, you're using $47,500 across the state. It's a whole lot cheaper to live in certain other counties than it is here, so $47,500 is going to go a lot further. Are we going to start seeing teachers leaving more expensive districts so that they can see their money go further? And so that's a point as well.
And the other issue, the idea is it will support bringing in new teachers. Part of the reason we have to bring in new teachers is veteran teachers are quitting in some places in record numbers because of the funding and no money. And so if we can keep veteran teachers by sharing the wealth, so to speak, then we won't have to have as many new teachers, if that makes sense.
And so that's why we're going to be watching this during the legislative session very closely. We're willing to work with the legislator to come up with a plan in order that will be able to reach all teachers and compensate all teachers.
I was just going to say, it seems as though every locality has its own issues, and that whatever they distribute for teacher salaries should be negotiated at the local level rather than assigned at the state level.
And we would be in support of that, most definitely. And I know that our local CTA, I'm sure, would be in support of that as well. So now looking at enrollment trends, the chart on the left is shows declining enrollment in Broward, Dade, and Martin. So the top line, the blue bar, is Palm Beach County. So when you compare Palm Beach County to Broward, Dade, and Martin, you can say we're the only one that has not seen declining enrollment in the past 2 years. We had very minimal growth in FY19. But at least it was some growth, so that shows that we're above that 0% line. But Broward, Dade, and Martin all had declining enrollment, so their enrollment was actually reducing. The chart on the right-hand side is just a comparison of the other large urban districts, and you can see that with the first two, Broward and Dade, you can see how their enrollment has actually declined. Their percentage growth is negative. But then comparing that to Hillsborough, Orange, and Polk, they've been seeing, even though their percentage increase has declined, they've been seeing pretty steady increases each year. And the problem with declining enrollment is you usually don't see students leave one classroom in one school. They're scattered amongst the whole entire district, so you're going to see a decline in your revenue, but you're not going to see a corresponding decrease in your expenses, at least not an equivalent amount. So now getting into the legislative issues, we talked about the DCD analysis already, so we're waiting to see whether there is going to be a new methodology that's proposed for FY21. So we'll keep you posted on that, or whether they're going to stick with the Florida Price Level Index for next year. The next item is the Florida Empowerment Scholarship, which was approved last legislative session. So there were 18,000 scholarships that were available. All 18,000 of them were awarded. About 2.5% of them came from district-operated and charter schools. In FY21, There's not going to be 18,000 scholarships available. It's a percentage of the total enrollment. And so there's a total of about 7,000 scholarships that will be available for next year.
What exactly is Family Empowerment Scholarship?
That was something that was passed by the legislature last year, that if you, you have to meet an income level, and you had to attend a public school in the past, unless you were a brand new kindergarten student. And if a kindergarten student was accepted, your siblings are accepted as well. And then you can use the money, you would get the per student funding, and you could use that to go and attend a private school.
I see. Okay. So all of these scholarships end up going to private schools?
It can be any school.
What, well, could you use it to go to a non-assigned public school? I mean,
They did have, I think, the choice to go to any school, but then we would just be getting the funding.
right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, typically they take that money and go to a private school?
These are ones that left and went to private schools. Yeah. And like I mentioned, that there was a total of 681 within Palm Beach County, but not all of them were attending Palm Beach County schools. It was about 250 that were in.
That 18,000 number is statewide?
That's statewide. 18,000 is statewide. So it was 681 total from Palm Beach County that were eligible. But of the 681, there were only about 250 that actually left district-operated or charter schools because they were either new kindergarten students or they were siblings that were eligible for the award.
And they've also increased the financial requirement of the I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but you know what I mean.
Right, so what was it, 4 times the poverty level? Or there's an
Yeah,
income threshold, right, to be eligible, and I
they've
can't remember
raised
the exact number, but
they've raised it every year, or
right, so, and we're going into session, so this program could get
go
revisited. There, you know,
I
they
haven't
were,
seen anything yet, but
there was some coverage about how it was widely, successful because they placed all the scholarships by, I think, September, October this year. So there could be interest in trying to expand it. Right now, the current law has it growing automatically by about 7,000 kids a year.
So I already talked about this as well. So in the last legislative session, there was House Bill 7123, which said that we needed to share any future operating referendums with charter schools. So that's something that we'll continue to monitor because that would have a significant impact on us when we go for renewal for our referendum. There was also House Bill 7055, which requires school districts to make up any shortfall in the amount that the state funds charter school capital outlay. So if the state doesn't continue to maintain the amount they funded in FY19, then districts are required to make up that difference. The governor's proposal includes fully funding that capital outlay allocation, but that's something that we'd have to wait and see with the House and Senate proposals and what actually ends up getting approved. And then we have Senate Bill 360, which was filed by Senator Diaz, and there was a similar bill that was filed last year that requires that 80% of the FEFP is spent on classroom spending. It didn't really go anywhere last year, but we're going to monitor this again this year to see what happens. Because whenever you have just an arbitrary spending amount, they're leaving out a lot of very important costs. So if you were to look at, our budget right now and look at FEFP, about 69% or almost 70% is spent on the classroom. That doesn't include, 8% of classroom support. Within classroom support, that includes school psychologists, counselors, very important resources that are not being included within that number. So just creating some arbitrary 80% is going to cause cuts in other areas to just redirect them into direct classroom spending. And then are we supposed to just stop transporting students? And is security not going to be a priority anymore? So we'll continue to monitor that as well.
That's come up in the past. It used to be the 65% requirement several years ago, and it just seems to be the banter that you know, we don't need more money, we just need to spend it in the classroom. And then they, you know,
61 or 2.
yeah, so it's been around for a long time, and I think that's how they try to justify that we're 45th in the country in terms of funding, you know, that we just spend it better, we'd be all right.
And so with the board budget priorities, looking at how we're going to spend our funds, we always try to align them with the strategic plan and try to be good fiscal stewards of the taxpayer dollars. And you saw that even with the governor's proposal, which is a $50 million increase, there isn't that much left over to really do anything with, once you back out all of the specific state set-asides. So now we're going to get into the FY21 budget. So the FY21 budget is proposed to be $3.2 billion. The general fund is 69% of the total budget. And we're going to get into each piece of the pie here within the rest of the presentation. We have our special revenue funds. Those are our federal grant funds. And then you also have capital projects and debt service, which those two funds work pretty closely together. So starting with the general fund budget, the general fund budget is $2.2 billion. 76% of our budget is spent on schools, district-operated schools, charter schools, and then the referendum is 10% of our total budget. Departments are about 8% of our total budget, but that includes transportation, which is a very large piece of that department budget. We have our non-K-12 part of the budget, which is those costs that are, or those revenues that are generated outside of FEFP. So our voluntary pre-K program is not funded through the state FEFP program. SAC is our aftercare program. And then we have our adult and community ed program. So the adult ed fund, those are workforce dollars that have to be tracked separately and cannot be used on K-12 activities. We have our utilities, phone and data, and then capital maintenance transfer, which is all of those capital funds. We're allowed to use capital dollars for different, for eligible capital items that don't qualify as capital projects that are recorded within our general fund. So we do a transfer from our capital projects fund to our general fund. And then we have to maintain our contingency reserve at 3% to be in compliance with board policy. So when we look at that first piece of the pie at schools, that's $1.3 billion. We aren't expecting or planning on any major changes to the regular school-based allocation this year. You know that we've been really focusing on ESE and ELL the past couple years. I have Mr. McCormick and Mr. Owaka here today if there are any questions. But you know, last year we approved the purchase of 2 systems, Elevation for ELL and Ed Plan for ESE for the electronic IEP system. So they're in the process right now of implementing those 2 programs. We are going to start piloting. So once we have gone through and have some feedback from the pilot schools, we'll come back to the committee in order to share out. And once we have full implementation of those programs, we do expect that we are going to see a change. We are going to propose a change in our ELL and our ESE staff allocation models. So even though there's no major changes in our regular school-based allocations, we do expect a change in our alternative ed schools with our alternative ed schools. So I'm going to bring that back at a future meeting, what those changes will be. We would work through any changes with the Superintendent's Budget Review Committee. The Superintendent's Budget Review Committee has representatives from the principals. We have 3 principals of each level, and we make sure to have all types of schools covered so that they're fairly represented. You know, those with large ESE populations, those with high free and reduced lunch, low free and reduced lunch. We want to make sure that we're getting the experience and feedback from all schools. Our next Budget Advisory Committee is February 6th. And so at that point, we would be presenting, you know, what the changes are for the school-based allocations, and then we would be releasing our school budgets to mid to end February. And that's been our focus the past few years, is that principals have really pushed us to get the budgets out earlier so that they can plan for the next upcoming school year and be able to hire teachers earlier in the process. Because when we were releasing them in March and April, a lot of the teachers had already been hired at other districts. So we try to get out there first so we have access to the best possible candidates. So the next part is the voter referendum. So the voter referendum next year is going to be around $213 million. Like I mentioned, we're over 12,000 teachers are currently receiving retention supplements. We'll continue to fund over 700 art, music, PE teachers, choice and career academy, as well as over 300 school police and mental health professionals. Last year, the committee was very involved with that new school behavioral health position, and I'm very happy to report that every one of those positions, 170 positions, were filled at the start of the school year. So between the HR department and the principals, they did an outstanding job. I did not think that it was possible to have all those positions filled by the start of school, and they were all filled by the start of school. And I know that from the principal's perspective, we've been getting a lot of good feedback that that has been a very beneficial position at the school sites.
Where did all those people come from? Out of state or out of
No,
county?
I mean, I know to some extent they came from other local agencies.
Okay.
So, as I think I'd heard from Mr. Oswald, there's a few groups that weren't real happy with us because we kind of lured their employees away, but.
There's a county department that wasn't super happy.
Okay.
And also,
It's probably a mix. We could try to talk to HR maybe and get the committee a little more solid answer.
Just curious.
and some of them with the work with the co-located service providers that we had in the past, there were already people that were already working on the school site, but they were employed by other agencies that then applied for these jobs when they became available. And so that's why on the mental health side, we don't have as many of those co-located provider positions filled, because a lot of those positions shifted to district positions. So those community agencies are now looking to backfill those positions. So with the charter school pass-through, that's estimated next year to be at $181 million. So you can look, this shows the past few years. Going back to 2011, we were at 8,700 students in charter schools. We saw a significant spike between 2011 and 2016. That has stayed relatively steady. We did have a decrease from 2017 to 2018. And then we're seeing, a steady increase each year, a slight increase, but not like we were seeing between 2011 and 2015. It's always hard to estimate what the enrollment's going to be in charter schools. How many are actually going to open. They don't have to tell us until, 2 weeks before school starts. Are we going to have any closures? So it really is difficult to estimate what the enrollment increase is going to be.
And there's a bill being proposed that says now there's a time frame you have to apply for charter, to be a charter school, correct?
Well, they have to apply by February 1st.
Okay.
And then they would be able to open not that upcoming school year, but the following school year.
And the new bill says they can apply anytime during the calendar year. And I don't know what the impact would be.
Right now, they can apply anytime during the year as well, but if it's prior to that February 1st, they can't open the next school year.
What it does is it takes off that February 1st thing, and I didn't know how much impact that would cause to the district.
It depends. We did receive one right before Christmas break, and then there's a certain number of days we have to review it before we have to get it to the school board. It might be easier to get them scattered throughout the year rather than having 5 of them all at once, because they do take a lot of time to review, and the deadline doesn't change. Our turnaround time doesn't change. So
There were some other things in the bill, but
I'm sure there are. I will remain silent on charter schools because I will go off on a tangent. There are some good ones, but there are also some bad apples. When we're looking at departments are $174 million. We released a bulletin to department heads on December 13th, letting them know there really are not, there's not new funding available. Whatever funding we do get is most likely going to be earmarked specifically for teachers and school sites. So I don't expect there to be any significant changes within departments, but I know there was a recommendation from the committee last year. You wanted to make sure if we have any changes in departments that you see it earlier. So we moved up our process. So we'll be meeting and having all of those, we'll be having those department line item reviews with the superintendent in February, so that when we present at the March 19th meeting, if there are any changes to departments, that's when they'll be presented. We have approximately 60 departments. Transportation makes up 30% of the department budget. We talked a little bit about those non-K-12 programs. They total $89 million. So we have our after-school program, it's about $43 million. Adult and community ed is about $21 million. VPK is $10 million. That's funded through state and parent fees. And then miscellaneous local donations and school internal accounts, that's about $15 million. So that's money that the schools actually send up to us because they receive donations at their schools, but then they're using their purchasing card in order to pay for things. So it's recognized as revenue in in the general fund, as well as the related expenses with that. So that's more of an in and an out. It's about $15 million. Capital maintenance transfer is expected to increase to $106 million. And like I talked about, these are things that we're allowed to use capital money for, but they don't qualify as capital projects. So we do this transfer from the capital projects fund. Includes things like property and flood insurance. And some of those smaller facility maintenance projects. And this is really all remaining other components within the budget. So we have other miscellaneous is $10 million. Those are things that just don't match or don't fall anywhere else within the budget. So we have claims and judgments that come through. The Education Foundation, which we provide funding to, that was approved by the board. Those insurance policies for student athletics. Those insurance policies that are not property related. We also have utilities, phone, and data. That's about $49 million, expected to be similar to what it is this year. The same with employee leave payouts, about $17 million. And maintaining the board contingency reserve, we'll see a slight increase to keep us at the 3%. So now we're going to look at the special revenue fund budget, and this is something we haven't looked at in the past. So special revenue fund are all the grants that we receive, so federal, state, and local grants. The first piece of the pie, it's broken out into two pieces of the food service program and then all other federal programs. So the food service program is $116 million. It's not always tracked within a special revenue fund. That's a requirement by the state of Florida. It includes federal revenue, that's the bulk of it, 84%, and then local sources, so student collections and fees is about 15%, but this funds our food service operations, breakfast, lunch, and there are some schools that also have dinner programs as well. So then the other component is the special revenue fund other budget, so that's all our other federal grants. So it's $160 million, which is comprised of 150 grants. Two grants in particular, Title I and IDEA, make up over 50% of that total budget. So when looking at the federal programs, there's two types of federal awards that we receive. You have entitlement grants, which those mean that just based on the students that we have that are eligible, we're going to receive the award, or the other type is a competitive award. So competitive are ones where we actively go out and seek and have to apply, and we're competing for that money. even the entitlement grants, even though we're entitled to receive those awards because of the students we have, we still have to apply for them. So we still have to fill out an application, and the state still has to review it. So we are going to walk through, we're going to start with Individuals with Disability Education Act, which is IDEA for short. That's $41 million. The amount we receive is based on a state funding formula. The award starts or is effective July 1st and goes through June 30th, even though a lot of times the state doesn't give us our actual award amount until over the summer months. We have to estimate what we think it's going to be. IDEA is in addition to and is supposed to supplement the funding of ESE students within our general fund. So in order to receive these federal funds, we have to prove that we spent the same amount on special education students in the previous year. Otherwise, it looks like we're supplanting, which is not allowed within the federal grant requirements. So if we were to reduce the amount we're funding for our special education students and then use this IDEA money, although it's an allowable cost, to make up that shortfall, we're then going to get in trouble because we reduced the amount we were funding within the general fund. So we always have to make sure that we maintain whatever we spent on special education students in the previous year, and this is in addition to what that funding is, to provide additional supports. So we primarily use our IDEA funding for staff, one-on-one paraprofessionals, BIAs, CITs, resource teachers, and then there's also a lot of supplemental services that we provide to the schools as well, and a significant amount of professional development. So I'm sorry for it being so small, but there's so much. So that's an overview of the IDEA allocation. I do have Mr. McCormick here if you have any specific questions related to IDEA. The next grant we're going to look at is Title I Part A. So that's the second large one that we have, and it's $47 million. So the purpose within the federal law is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and close the educational achievement gaps. And the reason why I read that is because it is very vague as to what you're allowed to spend your Title I money on. You can pretty much spend it on anything. The state has taken a more detailed approach, and they added in the additional, reaching at a minimum proficiency on challenging state academic achievement standards and assessments, and the state's ESSA plan effective metrics. And the reason why I focus on that is because our state, it's much more involved in how we spend our Title I dollars than I have seen in any other state. When we prepare our application and submit it, they review it at a very detailed level to the point where they'll look at the professional development and say, I think that costs too much money. You either can send fewer teachers, or that we just think it's too much altogether and we're not going to approve it. Or if we select a certain consultant, or a school is selecting a certain consultant, the Florida Department of Education might disagree and say, well, in our opinion, we don't think that you're going to get much return on the use of that consultant from what we've seen, so we're not going to approve it. We recommend you pick one of these instead. And so it's a very detailed review at the state level. Like I said, much more than I've seen with other states.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So, the proficiency testing to make sure in Title I, is that an income level, or is it a disability level, or is it everything?
It's based on free and reduced lunch level.
Okay.
And so based on the free and reduced lunch level of the students within the district, that's how we get the award, the total amount of the award that we receive. It's a state formula in order for the calculation.
So it includes some of the kids from the previous category that might have a learning disability?
If proficiency is included in that. And I know, Nicole Smith is actually, she's the director of Title I, so she can come up and give you some
Well, no, I'm just trying to, we talked about this last year about how everybody wants the kids to be equally educated and proficiency, and yet if you look at the report card, it's if you have autism or any dyslexia or something like that, you're still graded and you still get the same proficiency rating, so it doesn't really show that they've actually achieved more, or that they've
Showing the
actually-
actual growth.
Yeah, they put them all in the same category on the report card. So if you're trying to achieve that, but you're all under the same rules on the report card, you know, it'll show hasn't achieved, when in fact the student has, based on a different, so I just didn't know if they were considering changing that. And again, I think we talked about it last year, whether report cards could be identified for different, you know, learning disabilities type of kids, and I guess not. So they're just doing everybody the same.
Yeah, specifically for the report cards, yes. And I did look into that, and we can talk about it afterwards.
Can I just add
Sure.
on this one? So they do differentiate just a bit when it comes to, it's like for my school, let's just say this, I have a large ESE population. So there's different tests that my ESE students will take, and it's also, when you're looking here, they're not really focusing so much on the report card as they are on really state assessments and how well the students do on testing.
Right.
And so the state provides modifications, the state provides, what is it called?
Access points.
Access points. They also, we were able to take a look at the students at different levels. So that's where you get that differentiation.
Okay.
So when it comes to funding, they don't do anything regarding report cards.
Okay.
So even though report cards, that's probably a whole other challenge, you know what I'm saying, in and of itself, this is always done based upon
Okay.
the testing and state rules.
That's good to know.
And my only comment to that is the ESSA standards does require all subgroups to meet that standard. So if it's general education standards, even the child with dyslexia or autism who are on general education standards need to meet that same standard as every other student. It's not the same for children on access points who would otherwise take the Florida Standards Alternative Assessment.
Okay.
And then we have gains. And so what's nice about this is that when it comes to funding, when it comes to being recognized by the state, you get almost just about equal points for gains, and that's where a lot of our students with disabilities, they may not be proficient,
Right.
but if they're
Okay.
making these steady gains, it's pretty good.
Okay, thanks.
And so this award is also available July 1st through June 30th. It takes the state time to give us the actual award amount, so we might not receive the actual award until the summer or fall. We still release a proposed allocation to the schools when we release their school budgets in February, and then it's something we have to true up once we get the actual award from the state. Based on the federal level, there was an increase in Title I funding, but it is dependent on how the state wants to allocate it. So we can't really say for certain that we're going to see an increase in the awards for school districts, but it is possible this year because at least the federal government did increase the amount. And when you look at the state-approved set-aside, so Florida actually they mandate that we can only use 10% of the award, no more than 10% of the award, including our indirect cost allocation, which is allowed for federal purposes, for what they consider administration. And then there are other federal set-asides that we have to make sure that we meet, like the homeless program and delinquent and neglected program. We're allowed to also set aside money for pre-K, but anything else then has to be allocated to the schools. And so that's unusual as well, because the state normally doesn't get into that level of detail of mandating how we use our Title I funds. And so I was at a conference recently, and Miami-Dade was also represented, and the other states that were there could not believe how much we were restricted when it came to the Title I allocation. Because you don't have to allocate really any of the allocation to schools. It's up to the LEA and how, whatever their allocation methodology is, but now almost 90% of it, has to be allocated directly to schools. And I'm not saying that's bad, but that should be our choice and shouldn't be something that's mandated to us. Because there were certain programs that we had to stop that we were doing centrally, like allocating certain positions to schools, single school culture coordinator positions, because the award that a school received wasn't enough to actually pay for a position. So we were using our centralized dollars to allocate positions to school sites, just because based on their enrollment, they weren't getting enough. But we then had to, redistribute that whole allocation and no longer distribute or allocate positions. We're allocating dollars, which was difficult for some of those schools when they made the change because they didn't have enough money in order to pay for that position, or they would be using their whole allocation to pay for a position, but then they had other initiatives that they wanted to do that they would no longer be able to do, like tutoring for the students. So I know it was a very difficult change for the principals, and I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Nicole.
I just wanted to add that it's, when we were allowed to reserve some funds at the district level to provide some targeted support, we could identify the schools with the most needs. So those dollars had high impact because we could place the services where they were most needed. When we had to allocate out more to the schools, we have to spread it across the 125 eligible schools. So the impact is much smaller. And like Heather said, then we're not able to provide the same level of service for an additional $15,000, $16,000 that you could if you could withhold those funds at the district level and provide a full position to a school center.
Okay, so now the next two grants are related to migrant and immigrant programs. So we have Title I Part C is $2 million. And again, this is a federal program based on a federal allocation available July 1st through June 30th. And it's also based on a state funding formula, so it's an entitlement grant. And the allocation is based on a needs assessment that's completed every year. And all three, the Title III is very similar, and that's a $3 million grant. And then we have the Title III ELL grant, and the Title III immigrant grant is about $1 million. So between the three of them, it's about $5 million. And I have Mr. Awaka to explain the comprehensive needs assessment and the process that you go through each year in order to determine how you're going to allocate those funds.
Yeah, so we work with our parents, and then also at the district level, and then all of our parent leadership councils at the different schools. And then we also survey our district coordinators and our principals to determine where are the needs, what are the things that you're needing for us to do to help support you, not only for the migrant education program, but also for the new immigrant students, but then and also for our English language learners. So we do a comprehensive needs assessment every spring in conjunction with all the data, the school data, and our new ESSA state list, the targeted selected schools and comprehensive needs improvement. So all those pieces together, we determine where we need specific supports. So for example, in the immigrant grants, we have allocated ESOL success coaches in 4 of our largest high schools that need additional support. So actually, David Alfonso's school is a recipient of one of those positions, and we've had that for the last 2 years because their population continues to grow, and there's kind of a need for specific targeted instruction, not only for 9th graders, but also the 12th graders, getting them, making sure they're ready for graduation. So we really look at their data, but also the needs. So that's kind of all the pieces together, all focused on language development, all 3 of these programs. Except for migrant ed also talks about transition through different counties because our migrant students are traveling through states and different counties throughout the year.
And so when schools get their school budgets, they get their school budgets, and they also get any federal awards with their budget as well. What I think makes it difficult for a principal is a lot of this is siloed because we have the funding in different funds. So we're trying to work together between Mr. McCormick, Ms. Smith, and Mr. Awaka, and the budget department, so that the schools and the principals, we want them to look at their budget in totality and say, what are the needs of my students, and how can I use these funds to meet the needs of my students? So we're going to try to work together to make it easier from a budget and planning perspective for the principals, to be able to move those funds around more easily. So the board did approve, and something that we talked about last year was a new budget and planning system. We won't be using that for this upcoming FY21 year, but it will be implemented hopefully for FY22, and all budgets will be part of that process. So when the principal goes in, they'll be able to see all of their budgets in one place, and hopefully it will be easier for them to plan and utilize those funds, and they're not going to be wasted. And think about, just thinking about them as siloed resources, thinking about it all together in a comprehensive basis. So we're trying our best to work together to come up with a plan that will help support the principals in that direction.
And just to add to that, and how thankful we are as schools, especially schools that have a high ELL population, a high immigrant population like Palm Beach Lakes High School, one of the reasons why our graduation rate is increasing is because of this coach. And so when I first took over the school, and it was prior to having this coach, we would have about 50 of our ELL students that would get a certificate of completion but would not graduate because they didn't meet concordance. Once we had the coach, once we were able to focus and get that and really work with those students, you know what I'm saying, and have it, so we were able to bring that down from 50 to last year we only had 8 students, and we're still working with those 8 students. But so that's a huge thing, and so a lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of schools in our county that have a lot of needs, and to have this type of funding, and that it really does help us out considerably. So I just wanted to make sure I would add that, and a shameless plug for next year. Sorry.
He's like, also.
And by the way.
So here I just highlighted a few of our larger grants. Like I said, we receive 150 different awards, federal, state, and local funds. So we also have 21st Century, which we receive over $5 million in 21st Century. Those are after-school programs. And then we receive local funds from like the Pew Foundation and other different agencies to help provide additional supports for the schools. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Leanne to get into the capital projects and debt service budget.
Good morning, everyone. So this budget for FY21 is based on our 5-year capital plan, and we actually plan out 10 years in advance. We're required to publish 5 years, but because the referendum was a 10-year window, we started doing a 10-year look, and we've continued doing that, which is very helpful, especially when we're presenting on the FY21 budget. We're just getting started, but you have a good look at what it will look like. There will be changes prior to adoption. I expect the construction numbers will go up a little bit. Debt service, I think, is going to go down a little bit. But we'll move things around. The overall budget will increase because there'll be dollars in FY20 that aren't finished. There's construction projects that are just getting started. For example, Addison Meisner, they're starting that construction project now, and they won't start actual construction until school is out. But that's funded in this year, and those funds will all roll forward. So by the time we get to budget adoption for FY21, I expect we'll be closer to 1.1 or 1.2 billion. Just because of the construction projects and the sales tax projects that take 2 to 3 years to complete, they'll all roll forward. So I'm going to go through each of these components. These are the construction projects that are planned. These are the new ones that are coming in at FY21. And we have some big projects, the new high school out West Lake Worth near Lyons, O5C, which is a school that will be built next to Don Estridge, and Sunset Palms Middle School will be funding all 3 of those, as well as a number of replacement schools and some additions. So we have a lot of work going on with these schools.
Under the column of replacement and modernization projects, which are replacement and which are modernization?
They're really kind of a combination. We call them modernizations. In each case, we would like to tear down and fully replace the schools. But each building has to go through a process called a Castaldi, and the state has to approve tearing down a building. So while we would like to replace the entire school because it makes economic sense, they look at each individual building.
So that Castaldi process is not completed for those 4 projects?
It is not. They're underway right now for Grove Park and Melaleuca. We'll actually be funding them in their entirety for next year. We're starting design on those 2 schools right now. And then Pine Grove and Winbrook will only be funding design in FY21. The construction is in FY22. So they're a little further back in the process. I understand we have the permission to tear down, completely replace Melaleuca.
Good.
It's one of the oldest schools.
I have a personal
Yes, you do. Grove Park, we haven't received that authorization yet. We expect that with Grove Park, they will approve tearing down the entire building. We expect that'll happen with all of them, but there's always buildings that were added on later for one reason or another that we can't tear down. So we call them modernizations, although I'd like to say replacement, but it's not really that. It's something in between. So the schools will look like a brand new school. If we have to keep some schools, if we have to keep some buildings, we'll end up doing a major renovation on those buildings and they will look like they're brand new.
Are all these schools at capacity?
I don't believe all of them are. They vary, and when we rebuild the schools, we have to rebuild them based on current capacity, current student population.
So if they have a smaller student population, you build it to that smaller?
We have to build it smaller. All the construction projects, whether it's anyone that has student stations in it, there is a program called Cost Per Student Station. The state limits how much we're allowed to spend, and we're not allowed to build for more students than we have. So we've run into issues when the school is smaller and we have to build a smaller school. We have a real challenge building a very small school. The core of the school, the cafeteria, the library, office space, costs the same pretty much regardless of the size of the population of the school. So meeting that cost per student station becomes a big challenge on a smaller school. Grove Park is one that we've been struggling with, and I think we're going to end up keeping 2 or 3 buildings there. The plan at this point is to go in and take a backhoe and empty them out, gut them completely, and start from the studs to rebuild. The state would not give us, when you build the school, the new student stations, the new classroom building is subject to cost per student station. Renovation of existing buildings is not subject to cost per student station. So for Grove Park specifically, it will be broken into 2 projects, one for the new classrooms and one for the renovated classrooms.
I just know it's underutilized, but.
Yes, it is. And the new classrooms will be based on the number of students at the school. Debt service includes the long-term, which are certificates of participation. Typically, those are going out to 25 years. Our current debt service structure, we're reviewing that right now because we're getting ready to do our first borrowing essentially since 2007. And a lot of our debt will mature in 2030 and 2032. So there's a lot of capacity for debt service in the future. So we're probably going to be shortening some of the life of this debt, which I think will be very advantageous for the district overall. We're exploring that right now, and I think we'll be able to bring the budget down a little bit for some of the debt service in the future. And the short-term debt is for equipment leases that have been used to purchase buses in the past or air conditioning units, which we call chillers, and they're as big as buildings. They're very large units. We finance those over a 5-year window as opposed to a 20 or 25-year term. Facilities projects includes all the facility renewal projects which were funded with a sales tax. That includes air conditionings, roof, windows, doors, playgrounds, parking lots. All the work that's being done is included in this bucket. Building envelope is everything that keeps the building sealed, whether it's recaulking walls, replacing doors, windows, roofs. Air conditioning portables, we have to move them and replace them from time to time. Environmental issues, those are always a surprise when they happen. It's usually because there was a broken pipe and water leaked and all of a sudden you have mold on a wall and you have to go in and replace the drywall and clean it out. So we have money set aside for that. And fire life safety, self-explanatory. But the sales tax is really been key to try to catch up on the work that was needed. That is a 10-year tax that will continue until 2026. And the last of the money probably will be spent probably 1 to 2 years after that, after the money comes in. So this is a huge emphasis for the district right now, and we are, as Heather said, very grateful for the support of the community because our schools would be in pretty dire shape if we did not have this extra revenue coming in. The other components, technology, education technology, I kind of blur the line between those two frequently, but it's 2 different groups. Technology is dealing with the infrastructure. and the actual computers. And then education technology is dealing with all of the flat panels that we're rolling out to the classrooms right now, things that are directly working with the teachers and education. School buses, vehicles, and equipment, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's all the other stuff we need to go in the school. We do have money set aside in years 21 through the rest of the capital plan for charter schools in case the state does not fully fund the charter school capital outlay. So on an annual basis, once the legislative session is done, we'll have money available that we can use for other projects. We already know that if the state does fund the charter school capital outlay this year, it will be used for computers. When we did this capital plan, we didn't have enough money to replace the computers that we needed to do. We're planning to do a 5-year lease to pay for them. I'd much rather just pay for the units up front, and so if that money comes back, we would eliminate a financing and pay for the computers up front.
With the money that the charter schools, do you have any oversight over what they use it for? Does the district or?
They have to follow a list. There's a list provided, basically the same rules the district has as to how the money can be used. And then we do have reserves. Over the capital plan, the 10-year capital plan, most of the reserves are in the last 5 years. We built into the sales tax a $52 million reserve. Lots of things can happen over a 10-year window. There's no guarantee we'll receive all the sales tax revenue we projected. We are seeing construction costs rise. There's a lot of things that go on over a 10-year window. I'm certain that there'll be an economic downturn over the 10-year window. I mean, it's just economic cycles happen. So the $50 million out of the $1.3 billion we expect to collect is actually a very small amount. And it's right now budgeted in the out years, in the last 5 years of the capital plan. And I'll hand this back to Heather now.
Yeah, so now just recapping what our challenges are for FY21. We talked about enrollment trends. What is the actual increase in enrollment going to be? Looking at the number of schools that that are identified as low 300. Over the past 3 years, the number of district-operated schools identified as low 300 has declined. So in FY18, we were at a high of 27. By FY20, we were down to 17, but that is an additional cost. And so if there are more schools, then it will be an additional cost in the budget. If there's less, then that would free up money for us to use for other purposes. With the legislative session, we don't know what's going to happen, but one thing that's likely going to happen is there are going to be some unfunded or at least underfunded mandates, them telling us what to do and just not giving us enough money to actually make it happen. So just being closely watching the legislative session for what happens this year. Looking at the actual tax roll, and come 7/1, what is the actual certification versus the projection? Because we are seeing that it is going to grow, but we are seeing the growth in property values is starting to slow. With the federal grants, so we do know that at least at a federal level there is an increase, but what is that going to look like for us in Palm Beach County? How is the state going to adjust the awards to the districts? We do have some uncertainty, like Ms. Evans had mentioned, about the charter school capital outlay. In the governor's proposal, he's proposing to fully fund the charter school capital outlay, but we still need the House and Senate proposals and what's going to come out of the final conference. And having a 10-year plan is a long window, so what are those construction costs going to look like? Over the 10 years, are we going to start seeing rising costs just based on the environment? So there are still a lot of unknowns, but is what we're facing for FY21. So we do have our future meetings set up. Let me see. I have them on the agenda, but our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, February 6th. We have our next, we also have a budget workshop that will be in February as well. The first day of the session is going to start January 14th. So by our next meeting in February, hopefully I should have the House and Senate proposals. So we'll be able to show a comparison and see how closely they align, and to give us a better idea as to what our allocation is going to look like for FY21. We have another budget advisory committee scheduled for March 19th. The last day of that will align with the last day of the regular session of March 13th, so hopefully we'll have what the final budget is by that time, and also the impact of any departments. So that's what will be reported at your March 19th meeting. Then we'll have another budget advisory committee on May 7th, and if needed, a final meeting on June 4th. Yes.
The agenda says Tuesday, May 7th. May 7th is a Thursday.
Oh,
so
it is Thursday. It was Thursday.
It'll be Thursday again?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's if these are proposed dates for
I
the committee,
understand.
for you guys to.
But the intention was Thursday.
The intention was Thursday, May 7th.
Can I just make a comment as far as March 19th? Is there any possibility of doing it in the afternoon versus the morning? That would be the only one for me that I have a conflict that day, but
I can definitely check to see if that's a
I
possibility.
don't know if anybody else has any issues, but, you know,
That would be
with
okay?
building.
The 19th?
Doesn't matter to you. Okay.
Okay, I will check to see whether I can do that one in the afternoon. Because I have to make sure the boardroom is available because they have to be recorded. So then our board approved, the advertisements for the budget will be presented to the board July 22nd. Tentative budget adoption is July 29th, and final budget adoption is September 9th. And these are all driven by legislative requirements. There are certain dates and timelines we need to follow. So with that, do we have any questions? Any other questions from the committee? All right, so then, actually, the next item, the last item on the agenda is the selection of a chair and vice chair.
I nominate Sherry Brown to be chairman.
Second.
Any seconds? Okay, so all in favor of electing Ms. Sherry Brown as chair signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right, so with that, I have to say with unanimous support, Ms. Sherry Brown, you are reelected as chair.
Thank you.
And so now I can open the floor and take nominations for vice chair. Dr. Gunlack is the current vice chair.
I nominate Dr. Gunlight.
Okay, second. Okay, all in favor of electing Dr. Gunlack as vice chair, by saying aye.
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 With that, Dr. Gunlack, you are now elected vice chair. So, thank you very much. Okay, I turn it back to you.
Thank you.
Easier than the primaries.
Right? No hanging chads. That was great. We can vote in Palm Beach County. Any other comments before then we'll adjourn. Thank you.
All right, thank you all very much.